Okay, so welcome back. So we're in the history of the 20th century. The book, we are in chapter 7. Historically, the German and Polish border is loaded up with troops. Germany is getting ready to invade. They make it look like the Poles started the aggression, and so we're off. We're in September 1st, 1939. It says the Germans bombed the Air Force bases in Poland, destroying many planes before they were able to get off the ground. The German forces used the Panzer tank. They begin by killing the officials and the priests. And why do they do this? Well, basically, they're looking to take out any strong leaders or personalities in the society, all the people that could give strength to the Polish people. There's random violence that was used to keep everyone guessing, keeping them on their toes, on their heels, and just disoriented. It took 2 days for the French and the British to decide to go to war. Everyone else was slower in their decision-making process. A passenger boat from England was sunk by a German submarine, and the French troops passed over into German territory. So now the Germans, they drove the Poles towards the Russian troops coming from the west. So, okay, a little bit of coordination there. And after 3 weeks since the start of the invasion, the capital Warsaw was surrounded by troops, and they surrendered September 26. There's already about 60,000 Polish military troops who have died, and on the Polish civilian side, 25,000. German losses are very small in comparison, only 14,000. So Hitler starts his plans for the offensive in Holland, in Belgium, Luxembourg, and northeast France. Now, the British lose a cruiser to a German warship. The German ship would go into waters of their allies. Goes on, lots of Poles are murdered. Soviet Union attacks Finland. As we know, there's been a Russification of Finland for a while. They've made Russia the official language, even though no one really speaks it as their mother tongue for the most part in Finland, but it's just what the Soviets want to do. So she has spent so much time trying to Russianize that area, so 25,000 Soviet troops die by fighting or by the weather. When Germany captures Poland, they gain lots of laborers to work in the German fields and the German factories. So that's something we don't often hear about, is how they took their captured peoples and then put them to work for the German offensive. Stalin orders a new offensive against the Mannheim Line, but the line held. The line was a defensive line built in Finland. So Finns, they're fighting tough. Again, kind of like we saw in World War One. Sometimes it's really difficult to uproot a defensive position. So the Swedish iron ore deposits were important. The Soviets break the Mannheim Line in Finland, and the Finns drop back to a secondary position. By March 8th, the second line is also broken. There's about 1.5 million tons of iron ore in Norway, and they were ready actually to go to Germany. They're already loaded up, looked like on ships. This was an important factor for the Germans. So the British make a plan to capture the iron ore and also to move into Finland to support those troops there. But the Germans intercept the communication and they overpower the British. So the fighting during the winter before cost the Soviets about 55,000 troops, while the Finns lost 27,000. So the Germans do take control of Copenhagen, and the Danish president gives up on control of Denmark. They also take control of Norway's capital, Oslo. Since German losses, they lose all 10 of their destroyers. But they're able to decode 30% of British secret messages, and the Germans cause massive losses to the British by dive bombing using their air force. So Winston Churchill replaces Neville Chamberlain as Britain's prime minister. He declares he wants full war. It's victory. Victory at all cost. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. He was quite an orator. If you haven't seen the movie, I think it's called The Darkest Night. It's about him. It's really good. So check that out. Germans hit the bridges over Rotterdam. Belgium's principal port, Antwerp, fell into German hands. So the German Air Force was very effective. The Italians and the Germans, they move into France. France signs the armistice, and they'd already lost about 92,000 troops. The Germans, they take any French ship that they can. Then Hitler makes a plan to attack the Soviet Union, which is really surprising because before they were allies. So now he's going to decide to go ahead and attack Stalin, which means that he would be basically creating, again, a war on two fronts, which always seemed like a bad deal for him. So they pick May 1941 as the date to attack the Soviets. Also, the Canadian troops come to assist the British. The German Air Force then begins to attack the British but they failed to take out the radar stations. The Germans actually faced heavy losses, 45 planes down for the Germans compared to 13 on the British side. The next day it's even worse. The Germans lose 71 to the British's 27. So the Germans begin to target supply chains and factories and communications rather than military installations. Britain had already, Britain had one ally that Germany could not touch, which was the United States, and they had set up a program with the Americans, a lend-lease system for getting their hands on arms, boats, planes, whatever. So one, to fully equip and maintain 10 additional British divisions. Their weapons would be manufactured in the U.S., and also the U.S. would build 300 merchant ships for the Brits, provided on a rent or lend-lease basis for all arms purchased. The British bombing raids on the night of Hitler's anniversary celebration of the beer hall push angered Hitler that he ordered a series of counter raids. They bombed the British targeting ammunition factories, and the civilian toll was very high. At the same time, Mussolini invades Greece, but it took 2 weeks, and eventually the Greeks stopped the push. The British had cracked the Enigma code and were able to read the most top-secret messages sent to the field officers. Imitation Game is a great movie. Also, if you get bored studying about this stuff, you want to just kick back and watch a movie, but still kind of keep the information coming, that's a good one. It's about decoding the Enigma. So Leon Trotsky, remember him? I guess he was the former Polish leader. He started the Red Army. He's then in a high position in the Russians and the Soviets. But at that time he had been exiled to Mexico. Well, he's murdered. And the book says it shows how long the arm of revenge could be after all the loyalty, after that, all those loyal to Trotsky were also rounded up in camps and killed. So, geez, brutal, right? In Poland, Auschwitz is set up for Poles who were disobedient. They use a commercial pesticide called Zyklon B in order to, gas people. British troops are sent to Greece. In Yugoslavia, the regent allows the Germans to pass through his lands. Bombing continues to kill 4,000 to 5,000 people a day in London. The best warship of the German fleet was sunk, and so that's pretty big. Finally, the long-awaited invasion of the Soviet Union began June 1941. The Germans immediately killed many people in villages, especially Russian Jews. They killed parents and prisoners of war and children. Now, one thing we'll come to see is they started too late. See, they probably needed that extra month. They planned for May. They started in June. The winter ended up getting them. June 29th, 1941, Stalin orders the destruction of everything that could be destroyed. To deny it to the Germans, this scorched earth policy would be carried out in every locality that was about to be abandoned. Blow up bridges, railway tracks, telephone communications, whatever. A few days later, they decide to evacuate all factories on the line of the German advance throughout the industrial regions of southern Russia. The last defense line protecting Moscow was broken. Hitler was very happy. In response, the Americans gave a lot of arms to the Soviets. Germany, now this is weird, they kind of make a deviation. They were going for Moscow, and they kind of take a detour, and they decide they want to take Leningrad. So they take Leningrad, and they see that about 90,000 German troops are killed in the struggle. They also take Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and about 50,000 Soviet troops were taken prisoner. Most of the 50,000 would die of intentional starvation during the winter that was already setting in. So more supplies, tanks, guns, and whatever are sent to Russia. The snow set in, which was helpful for the defenders, the Russians. But by November the 12th, the temperatures dropped to negative 12 Celsius, which had lots of guys, suffering from frostbite, low morale. It's very depressing to be cold and not be able to get warm. And they were simply not equipped to fight in these low temperatures. They didn't have the right clothing. Berlin had assumed that the war would have been well won before the winter set in. But see, the Russians, they were all trained to fight in this type of weather. This was their homeland. They had home field advantage. But guys were literally like freezing to death at night. They would be out, watching guard or, whatever, manning their post, and would, they'd be dead when they were found the next morning. The German morale was breaking, and Hitler was demanding them to push forward. Hitler knew, this is the word the book used, Hitler knew that he must take Moscow immediately or face an unending war. But it was 35 degrees below zero. So basically to get the tanks to start, they would have to start a fire underneath the tanks and keep it going for 4 hours. And basically it's just they were not able to take Moscow, nor were he able to take it, nor was he able to burn it to the ground. It's just he couldn't get there. The winter was too severe. So as the Germans were being pushed back from Moscow, the Japanese bombers and fighters attacked Pearl Harbor. Now this was Japan's ambition. Japan had also bombed an American airfield in the Philippines and in Hong Kong. Hitler believed the Japanese would quickly defeat the United States, so he declares war against the U.S., and this gives the U.S. the right or the moral reason or whatever to go ahead and engage. Whatever treaties were broken or whatever, now they had the green light. So they became more belligerent, and therefore they would come into the war against Germany. Now, many Germans needed amputations for like gangrene. I mean, not many survived that awful winter. Thousands of civilians were starving to death in Leningrad. So things are bad. The SS killed 135,000 people, and about 38,000 of those were children. Singapore surrenders to the Japanese. Prior to this, the British controlled Singapore. So, Britain is really having a tough time too, coming up with enough troops, enough, arms and everything to. I mean, she's all spread out anyway, so it's going to be hard for her to not lose something with all this going on. So the Russians begin to fight a guerrilla warfare. They use the forest and the swamps as cover, and they attack storehouses, supply lines, whatever they can with the Germans. So then the following May, we make it through the winter, we get to the May, and the German goes for a new offensive against the Soviets. And the Germans are also very successful in North Africa that next spring. The Japanese and the German, they both achieve victories, but at really high cost. The Americans intercepted Japanese communication about the attack on Midway, which was an important stepping stone that would serve the plans of the Japanese to eventually invade Hawaii. But the Americans sunk all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers. There was 332 Japanese planes lost that day. The Japanese needed a railway to basically go from Burma to Thailand, and they basically worked 15,000 prisoners of war to death in order to make that happen. So Hitler is very confident of victory in Russia. But the Americans land 16,000 troops in the Solomon Islands. The Germans, they do get to Stalingrad, but they have a very difficult time fighting in the city. They're very, very slow to take the large amount of waterfront in that city. And the Germans never take the oil fields in the Caucasus, which, that's, any resource is important at that point. The Americans land in North Africa and take a significant amount of land. Rommel is driven back 200 miles. Hitler takes planes from the East Front and sends them to North Africa. Rommel is seeing his defeat coming, and he's asking Hitler, let me withdraw from North Africa. But Hitler refuses. At the same time, in Chicago, a scientist, Enrico Fermi, comes to understand a nuclear chain reaction. Americans start to push back the Japanese in the Pacific. So Germany abandons North African airfields. They withdraw to Sicily, a small island just south of the tip of Italy. The Germans have some dams destroyed, which were important for their industry. The Americans and British are bombing Germany day and night. The Russians are able to hold back an offensive attack by the Germans on Stalingrad, and also the Allies invade Sicily in a huge battle. The British firebomb Hamburg, a city in Germany. About 42,000 civilians die. The report is that if this happens to another city in Germany, the war may be over for the Germans. So the Germans are retreating from Sicily and from Kharkov. In Italy, Mussolini is captured by anti-fascists, but about 12 German commandos take him out of the hands of 120 Italian captors. Fail army. In Burma, a rebel group called the Karens was established. Despite dropping 2,000 tons of bombs on Germany each day, the Germans were rebuilding factories and had somehow miraculously managed to almost double the number of airplanes being produced. There are now about 500,000 troops coming from Russia. They have a superior air power as well as fuel supply. The Germans do not have time to set up defenses. There are 38,000 Germans killed, and 116,000 German troops are captured by the Russians. There were also internal plots to kill Hitler. He survives one, and meets with Mussolini later that day. I guess a pretty tough guy, or pretty committed. The Soviets come near to Warsaw, and the Poles are afraid of communists, so they begin fighting against the Russians. Romanians sign an armistice with the Russians. This cuts off oil supply to the Germans. The Germans bring in missiles into the war, so they're still developing, new technologies, even in the spite of all this. So the Jews try to revolt inside of the labor or the death camps. Hitler's body starts to die. He's weak. He has trouble walking. He's maybe under a lot of stress. He did survive. Maybe he was injured by that assassination attack, that bomb that went off. Maybe he's just old. But on October 6th, the Germans introduced a jet aircraft into the war. So now they have a jet aircraft, and the Japanese began using kamikaze missions against American warships. President Roosevelt wins another election. He's elected to his fourth term as American president. Also, the Hungarians, they turn against the Germans. 3 million Germans face 6 million Russians on the Eastern Front, so heavily outnumbered. German forces continue to take large losses in Poland and in Hungary. American bombers hit Tokyo with incendiary bombs. Mussolini is killed after trying to escape by disguise. Hitler is blaming the Jews for all the troubles of the war. General Douglas MacArthur, the American general, announces the liberation of the Philippines from the Japanese resistance. The American plan to go onto the shore of Japan is still being developed, or it's in the works. So then you have the Potsdam Conference. Churchill, Stalin, and Truman were deciding the fate of post-war Germany. Suddenly, Churchill is told he has been succeeded in the previous day's election. At the conference, they conclude for the removal of Germans from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, and from Hungary. Truman thinks about the atom bomb. One bomb kills 92,000 people immediately, and 138,000 are killed by radiation. There was a second mission to drop a second bomb on Kokura, but there was smog, and the target was reassigned to Nagasaki, where 40,000 Japanese people died. With the Japanese weakened from Stalin and the Americans now takes this opportunity to take back lands, he wanted to extend communism as far as possible. Remember, Japan had taken all that land in China previously. It had been very successful. So the USS Missouri is the place where the Japanese signed the unconditional surrender. Chapter 8, Recovery and Relapse, 1946 to 1956. So we're going to do a 10-year chunk here. Chapter 8. The history of the 20th century. The first meeting of the United Nations was held in London, January 1946. 51 nations were present, but neither Germany nor Japan were there. The U.S. representative said something like, if we are to be a great power, we must protect ourselves and also others. Hence, the policing of the world mentality unfolds. Especially we see this to be true for the Americans. For America, this meant regulating the Soviet ambitions of achieving their own atomic power, their own atomic bomb. The American troops came back to America with a better sense of living conditions worldwide. So they had seen the world. They saw how Europeans lived and suffered under German control. So the Fulbright Scholarship was created by Senator Fulbright in order to sponsor international students to study and perhaps help their countries develop. The U.S. was the largest contributor to UNICEF, the arm of the UN dedicated to children, and the UN's International Children's Emergency Fund, which is what that is. So at Nuremberg, 12 Germans were given the death sentence for war crimes. Many Jews who escaped the concentration camps were still met with opposition and violence. They mainly moved to Palestine if they moved anywhere. So then in Paris, you have Ho Chi Minh. He was trying to negotiate with the French for an armistice between his Viet Minh soldiers and the French colonial forces. But a boat was attacked, and there was a counterattack. A port was taken, and fighting spread throughout Vietnam. The Vietnamese would run their troops through China. And so it was really true that they were pretty, well familiar with war and were well trained and well adapted to it by the time the Americans come into the fight in the 60s. But that's not for a little bit, that's a bit into the future, I should say. So there's riots in Bombay, in India, that is. The decision is made that no more British citizens will be able to serve in the Indian Air Force or the Navy. In France, they nationalized coal, the gas industries, the electrical industry, and 9 of the big main insurance companies. After the war, Italy was struggling to rebuild and also to form a new government. The vote favored a republic, and there were riots of pro-monarch versus anti-monarch. And it was very close, but the people voted for republic, and so that was settled. In Germany, however, everyone was looking for reparations. The Soviets, the Allies, everybody wanted, their piece of the pie. They thought that Germany owed them something for their trouble. So they didn't have a lot of money, so what did they have? Well, the German trade secrets were distributed to the Allies, along with physical assets, tools, boats. Some of the factories were destroyed. Within a year, they changed their minds. As they needed to leave Germany with enough to have some strength to keep Russia from total dominance in the region. That's what the Allies were thinking. Hey, if Germany is completely weakened, they're not going to be able to stand up to this big Russian-Soviet threat. So the Americans are the first to stop reparations against Germany in order to help the German economy have something to rebuild with. The British and the French, they do the same thing eventually, but not the Russians. The Russians, they just keep stripping. They want business ideas, they want patents, they want anything that they can get from the Germans they want. So, hey, it's a different story for them. I mean, Stalingrad, Leningrad, all those peasants, all that stuff, all those people that died. I mean, the the Soviets had a different experience in some degree, but Austria receives its sovereignty. The Russians, without international permission, they go into Austria and they start taking industrial property, and they call it reparations. Hey, this is owed to us, so they just go in and take whatever they can take. And the Americans give about 280 factories to the Austrians. In Czechoslovakia, they refused to take a $50 million loan from the U.S., calling it imperialism. They took loans from other nations, so it was obviously the fear of the American control that they were most worried about. In the Soviet Union, only 4 out of 75 coal mines were working. 14 months after the fighting had stopped, the cult of Stalin increases. There's now like songs and books and pictures and radio programs and films about him. In China, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the arrest of Mao, but Mao escapes. Now, George Marshall, he's the U.S. Secretary of State, and he's eventually really famous for the Marshall Plan. Some people, they say that the Marshall Plan was, just an act of good-heartedness, kindness to the world. Other people, they say no, that there was definitely other motivations to it. So we'll see what this says. A massive aid package and assistance to any nation who needed help after the war. The Russians forbid the Eastern Europeans to receive assistance because the Russians didn't want them to be influenced. No one in the Soviet bloc accepted the Marshall Plan. The British make an agreement to part with Burma. They then announced that the rule in India would end within a year's time. Basically, the British were broke. They didn't want to spend money to have all the troops all over the world. They also now had Palestine to manage, but they couldn't do that either. So it goes to the UN to decide what to do. They decide for a 2-state solution where you have one area for the Arabs, another area for the Jews. A vote on November 29th. 33 vote for, 13 against this 2 independent state plan. The 13 against it were all Arab majority nations. Interestingly, India and Pakistan, who just went through partition, both voted against the 2-state solution. There's this book called Freedom at Midnight. It talks about basically the events leading up to and following the partition of Pakistan from India, and it was a total bloodbath. It was an absolute nightmare because you had a mix of Indians and you had a mix of Hindus and Muslims living in India. And the same was true, in Pakistan here. Well, when everyone knew that India was going to be Hindu and that Pakistan was going to be for the Muslims, they crisscrossed, right? You're going to want to go where everyone is like you, where you're going to be favored. You're not going to be the oppressed, godless heathen, And so when those two people, when they crossed each other's paths, it was a total slaughter. So the 2-state solution they weren't in favor of. Basically, the British had lost the will to rule. Other people say they lost the finances to rule. But India moves towards partition, but Kashmir is a contested point. In Vietnam, there's 115,000 French troops with armored vehicles, artillery, air support, and they're confronted by a military of guerrilla Viet Minh communist forces of about 100,000, but ill-armed and without an air force, and still they're, unbeaten. The guilt, perhaps, or the exposure to the world through the world conflict, the atom bombs, the Marshall Plan, the ideas of protecting the weak through the UN, this leads Truman to consider his own country, the race relations, the inequality at home. He wrote to Congress that segregation should be ended. In Britain, they looked to socialized medicine. In India, Gandhi wanted to see peace overcome violence and had agreed to stop fasting after the communist leaders had made some compromises. Then, in late January 1947, a man shoots Gandhi 3 times. He dies almost immediately. His assassin was a Hindu extremist who did not agree with Gandhi's message of cooperation between Muslims and Hindu untouchables. On March 14th, the United States passes the Marshall Plan, but Truman felt conflict with the Soviet Union, and he brings back compulsory military training. The U.S. encircles the Soviet Union by making bases in South Korea. Korea is divided with the communists in the north and the Democrats in the South, or pro-democracy in the South. So May 14th, 1947, the British mandate in Palestine comes to an end. And that same day, the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the new state of Israel. But the Arab states launch an immediate attack. Egyptian Air Force bombs Tel Aviv. The Transjordanian Arab Legion and the Syrian-based Arab Liberation Army advanced into the areas allocated to the Jews by the UN. The Arab Legion artillery bombarded the Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem. Egypt occupies the Gaza Strip. Millions of Jews from Cyprus, North Africa, and Iraq start moving into Israel. But inside Israel were 16,000 Arabs. They became Israeli citizens, but they would eventually make up 20% of the Israeli population and would always be treated as second-class citizens. In Berlin, back in Germany, which lay within the Soviet zone of Germany. This becomes a flashpoint of the Cold War confrontation of 1948. In May, the Soviet Union announced all Allied economic improvements of the Soviet Union, or of the Soviet zone, be stopped. So the Western powers disputed this, but the conflict was finalized when on June 7th in London, a six-power pact was signed, under which a constituent assembly and a federal government would be established in Western Germany based on democratic institutions. So Western Germany is, like the Western states, the Western nations, right? It's democratic. Eastern Germany is more like Russia toward the east and is communist. So the road race for the Western government, bring in humanitarian aid, but this was blocked. So the Western countries started doing airdrops to the people of Western Berlin. This was seen as a resistance to communist threats. There remained to be distrust, hatred, murder, and the like against the Jews. The history of World War II was silenced by Stalin. 5 countries formed the Consultative Council, which would later become the Defense Committee. Signees were Britain, France, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. In South Africa, the segregation of white Africans from those known as the colored was still intact. Marriages were prohibited between blacks and Africans. Intercourse was also prohibited between whites and coloreds in 1948. We have TV. We have the long-playing gramophone record. We have the drive-in hamburger chain McDonald's starting. We have the computer age begins with a machine that's able to remember numbers entered into it. Stalin is convinced that the price of keeping women and children in work camps is costing his government money, so he allows them to be released. The exception was mothers who had been found guilty of anti-government actions. President Truman's Fair Deal policy extended Social Security, raised the minimum wage, greatly increased federal housing. President Truman also gets into NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The other members are Canada, Britain, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, Italy, Portugal, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway. The formation of this group was shared resistance against future military aggression, primarily with the fear of aggression coming from the Soviet Union. May 23rd, the Federal Republic of Germany, also known as West Germany, comes into existence, with its capital in Bonn on the Rhine. East Germany, including East Berlin, remains under Soviet control. So there you go. The communist forces were winning in China at this point. So Mao is winning. He's doing good, I guess. Chiang Kai-shek asked the Western governments to mediate between the two warring sides. Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, aiming to, quote, oppose imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic forces, and also, quote unquote, eliminating counter-revolutionary forces. It says the Soviets and the Chinese had little in common ideologically. I mean, they're both communists, but Mao mixed in Confucianism with his Marxism, while Stalin tended to quote himself. In Czechoslovakia, the communist system was installed at every level of society. In Hungary, the Catholic cardinal was on trial for acting as a spy for the Americans. He was outspoken against communism, so they gave him penal servitude for life. You guys, this is, I mean, as an American, it's almost unbelievable to think that you could be thrown in prison for the rest of your life for an idea. But, I mean, look, it's happened. The Romanian government was also into communist rule and gave the death penalty to anyone who was found guilty of minor economic offenses. In Bulgaria, the term treason came to be defined as any act which weakened the relationship between Bulgaria and the Soviet Union. Sheesh. Stalin turned 70. The Soviets have their first successful test of an atom bomb. George Orwell writes 1984, set forth in an imaginary totalitarian world. Then the Soviets are manufacturing atom bombs. Truman is worried about the hydrogen bomb. Russia and China signed a 30-year pact of cooperation, thus the Cold War. Then there is a witch hunt started by Senator Joseph McCarthy. It's McCarthyism, if you hear people throw that term around, looking for communists wherever they might be, tapping everything, investigating everybody. So it was quite a thing. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, used the analogy of the witch hunts in Salem for communists working in the State Department. This was started by a pre-war German refugee giving away atomic secrets to the Russians. So it wasn't like it wasn't unfounded. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. You don't want that to happen, right? So Japan is under military occupation and hence extreme military pressure to avoid communism. A new war was about to break out in Korea when North Korea forces invade South Korea and push southward. Truman decides that democratic nations must intervene. Truman does not want to go to war in South Korea, but the North Korean army quickly destroys the army of the South Koreans. So what's he going to do? What's his other option? So what does he do? He sends General MacArthur back into action to assess the South Korean force, and he finds it demoralized and, yeah, not in good shape. He requests 2 divisions of American ground troops. The American troops go to the front lines, but they're outnumbered and outgunned. They retreat. General Walker orders that Pusan must not fall. They sustain heavy casualties. MacArthur has an idea to send troops by boat to attack a city that is far behind the front line. A successful operation would then be an attack on Incheon. 11 days later, the Americans take Seoul, but they are worried about the Soviets and the Chinese armies getting involved. So they secure the original boundary line of the 38th parallel, and all is back to how it was in the beginning, but Washington wants to, quote, see the destruction of the North Korean armed forces. So they cross over, taking Pyongyang, the capital of the North Koreans. It only takes them 10 days to do this, but now the British are involved. And everyone is worried about the Chinese entering the fight. So people have a disagreement about how far they should push into North Korea. Then the Chinese forces enter Tibet, and the Tibetans appeal for help from the UN. Okay, so the UN is really busy with Korea, and they decide not to help the Tibetans. MacArthur reports to Washington that there are already 30,000 Chinese troops inside North Korea. So he's saying, look, they're already involved. They're already here, 30,000 of them. And he says that peace will only come by totally defeating the enemy, while the politicians in London and Washington want him to back off, set up a defensive front. Well, somehow MacArthur has the ability to use the United Nations troops. I don't know how he got control of those troops, but somehow they end up under his leadership, under his command. So he pushes further into the northeast section of North Korea. Then the Chinese troops really come in. Then air support comes from the Chinese and the Soviet pilots flying MiG-15 jets. 24 hours until the United Nations troops were in retreat. So, I mean, it didn't take long once the Soviets and the Chinese showed up. Okay, so then December 5th, North Korean capital, Pyongyang, they abandoned it, MacArthur and whoever, they abandoned it. The UN forces who took the capital about a month and a half earlier. So MacArthur says he's fighting the entire Chinese nation in undeclared war. His own troops were mentally fatigued and physically battered. It's estimated that there's 400 to 450,000 Chinese troops inside North Korea. The UN forces retreat back past the 38th parallel. The UN offers the Chinese a peace deal or a ceasefire. The Chinese refuse. They send their troops over the 38th parallel into South Korea, so now they're on the offensive. And MacArthur wants Washington to drop 50 atom bombs on China, ending the proxy war. Washington and the Joint Chiefs agree with MacArthur. Can you imagine? 50? But Truman won't go along with it. So back in Vietnam, the French continue to fight with the Viet Minh. The French retreating from the north frontier areas, and they take defensive positions in the Red River Delta. The French know they must increase the input of resources if they're going to win the war, but they don't want to hurt the French economy. I guess it was humiliating for the French to withdraw or admit defeat. The Americans and the South Koreans are pushed out of Seoul. The commander, so Seoul, now back talking about, Seoul, South Korea. So now talking about South Korea again. The commander-in-chief of the Americans, General Walker, was killed in a jeep crash. His replacement, General Ridgway, this guy, I guess, was very well established. He was very successful. I wrote that he was a badass and a professional, but I guess people believed in him. He knew the Americans had superior air power, so he began destroying the supply lines of the enemy. Ridgway improved many things to set up better food, warmer clothing. He started MASH, the TV show, the mobile action hospital. It was the mobile whatever hospital, the mobile army surgical hospitals, right? So in Vietnam, the French are outnumbered, but they have the use of napalm, which helps them. Ridgway, back in Korea now, he retakes Seoul, and again, with the help of the troops from the UN, he again reestablishes the 38th parallel. Yeah, he has no intention of going further. He formed a 115-mile coast-to-coast defensive line. MacArthur wanted to put radioactive waste between North Korea and the Chinese border, so you have South Korea, you have North Korea, and then you have China. So they had kind of established the 38th parallel, and MacArthur wanted to put a whole bunch of radioactive waste up here between China and the northern border of North Korea. MacArthur, man. Jeez, dude. So MacArthur, along with Washington, gave the Chinese a truce agreement, but this agreement was rejected. Truman sacked or deposed MacArthur of his position because MacArthur was so set on war. The Republicans are pissed, saying that Truman is appeasing the communists, so the Chinese forces attacked the UN troops to the south of the 38th parallel. Lots of POWs and losses by the UN troops. The Gloucesters were led into captivity. 35% of POWs die in captivity. Interrogations, there's torture, but the Chinese could not recapture Seoul. Then the UN troops push back again and occupy North Korean soil. So it's a real back and forth in Korea. By the time the war in Korea is 1 year old, there's some peace talks, but the fighting also continues as the peace talks go on. Eventually, it's agreed upon that the existing ceasefire line should be the future border. Socialism in Britain did not deliver on its promises. The Conservatives from the Labour Party win the government. It was a close race, but Churchill once again was Prime Minister. I didn't know that. Huh. So then there was a large typhus epidemic that broke out in Manchuria, in northern China, and in North Korea. Now, there was accusations made against the Americans of sending germ-laden insects like flies, fleas, mosquitoes, or even clams that had cholera organisms in there. A formal charge of germ warfare was put forth in 1952. The Americans denied it, but the prisoners of war confessed to doing this according to the Chinese. 78 Americans have been interrogated and tortured. Of those, 38 confessed to germ warfare. The Mayo Clinic founder said that they were intentionally fed the minimum amount so that they would not die. Yeah, so I don't know how reliable people's testimonies are if they're coerced under torture. But the British announced that they have their own atom bomb. A month later, the U.S. does a test, detonation of the hydrogen bomb. The explosion on the island caused the island to disappear and left a hole in the ocean floor a few hundred feet deep. The A-bomb had explosive power of about 120,000 tons. The H-bomb has greater than, 5,000. No. Yes. 5,000. So 120 versus 5,000. Okay, so in Japan, they become a sovereign independent state. Hirohito remained the emperor. The Soviets elect Japan and vetoed their bid to join the United Nations. They reject Japan, sorry. The Soviets reject Japan. Also, the Soviets withdrew some of their military presence in Japan. Japan signs a friendship with Taiwan. So the UN forces carry out bombing attacks on power plants in North Korea. This was because there was a buildup of Chinese forces during the ceasefire negotiations. The British were pissed that the Americans did not consult with them first. There was a coup d'etat in Egypt, brought an end to the 16-year rule of King Farouk, and then Naguib took control. In Persia, you have Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who was able to withstand the Western countries' influences. He gains popular support and nationalizes all foreign oil interest in his country. Since 1914, the British have been the majority stakeholders of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. I just saw something that when they established that, the Iranians got 16% of the profits and the Brits took 84% of the profits, and somehow, even to this day, it's tied to British Petroleum, or it's this, I don't know. I'm not sure about this, what the tie is to British Petroleum besides the British influence. But anyway, quote, the cruelest of the British overseas conflicts was in the Kenyan colony, where the Mama secret society declared that its aim was to drive all Europeans from Kenya. There was a Christian group that was not part of the Mama. The Christians wanted to cooperate with the British, but their leader was murdered. The Mama leader, who was educated in a Scottish missionary school, was arrested and given life in prison. So now the democratic nations, right, are throwing people in prison for not agreeing with what they're supposed to agree with. In South Africa, it's pretty clear the British had lost control. The unjust laws of apartheid were repealed, but many Africans were arrested in the protests, as well as people losing their lives. In America, Senator McCarthy was still on his witch hunt for communists. Many people in America were apparently not loyal to the U.S. A guy makes an anti-McCarthy film and is blacklisted from working in Hollywood. He goes to Britain, writes the screenplay for the Oscar-winning film Ridge Over the River Kwai. Many captured POWs from North Korea side do not want to go back to North Korea. Wow. People are tired of Truman. They're tired of the Korean War. Eisenhower promises to end Korea. People elect him. So Truman writes in his journal that low public opinion is not the point. Rather, it was a matter of right or wrong. In Poland, the government seizes the power to end all appointments within the Catholic Church. In East Berlin, communist East Berlin, people were told they must increase production for the same pay. They riot. The People's Police join the demonstrators. Soon the Soviet commandant of Berlin proclaims a state of emergency. There were uprisings of Spanish rule, which comes to an end in Latin America. People often go to prison, and if they come out, they have more focus and more commitment to overcoming their captors. Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but only served 2 years. His release and his amnesty in Mexico is where he basically plans his return. So, Castro, again, another guy that sees prison time. Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Gandhi. It's just a theme that we see. In Russia, after Stalin dies, Nikita Khrushchev comes. In Czechoslovakia, short-term forced labor was commonplace, even for women. In Iran, there were religious Muslims supporting the 50-year-old Ayatollah Khomeini as they opposed the secular Shah. The Shah was trying to modernize the country, and following the Turkish example of Ataturk, he was trying to do it by a secular path, open to Western ideas, cultural influences. But the Muslim clerics, saw no value in this. Two doctors find the double helix structure of the DNA, or of DNA. Data also shows that life expectancy in Western countries had increased dramatically, about plus 20 years since, from 1900 to 1955. There's also a vaccine for polio, which is developed in the United States. Cancer is linked to smoking. Similar findings are related to air pollution. Eisenhower and Churchill disagree, but Eisenhower believes that nothing has changed for the Soviets and that they are hell-bent on ending capitalism and capitalist countries. He says the Soviet Union is a whore of the streets, and he speaks of using atomic power. Churchill argues that the Soviets cannot be all evil and that Eisenhower should reconsider. Now, people realize the effects of atomic radiation. Scientists in Japan realize that radioactive rain is falling on their cities, but that the radiation is not coming from American bomb tests. Rather, it was coming from the test run by the Soviets to their west. Brown versus the Board of Education occurs, overruling current prejudice, that it was not their environment, and it wasn't anything about the genes of black African Americans, that would cause them to be inferior, that there was nothing physiological that could be linked to any kind of inferiority. But it took a decade in America before the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, would really make civil rights a top priority. And of course, I don't mean to say that African American people are inferior. That was just a claim many people were making. So the U.S. and Canada set up a radar defense network, Nautilus. It was the first ever nuclear sub. It was launched by the United States. Basically, you see this huge growth in nuclear weapon capability. MacArthur urged the U.S. federal employees to turn over to him information about corruption or treason of their supervisors or anything related to this type of problem. But this was illegal. Workers could not betray the government in this fashion since those documents would be classified. The Attorney General does not support McCarthy. Now people are trying to get rid of him for conduct unbecoming to a senator. He was found to have acted improperly in urging federal employees to hand over documents to him. McCarthy fires back by calling the Senate a lynch party, but this was probably not a good move. His witch hunt ends with a vote in both houses of the Congress, and he is censured from that time forward. So NATO keeps building planes that can drop atomic weapons. The French commanders know that they cannot control Vietnam. They suggest dividing Indochina into northern and southern areas. The French are tired of the costly war that they believe they cannot win. They inform the Americans, who take up the cause of a unified Vietnam. Then we have the Baghdad Pact, a treaty between Iraq and Turkey based on mutual hatred of communist activity. So Britain and Iran also joined the pact. Now, many new nations were formed after World War II. They were upset that they were brought into a struggle or conflict that was not their problem, the Cold War. These were, the non-aligned states that everyone was trying to woo or coerce. You have the issue, the event with Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King, who are both residents of Montgomery, Alabama. Then there was the moral problem of the H-bomb. Not a military improvement, but it had so much downside risk, so much possible harm to humanity. People were really talking about, is this a moral thing to create? They also started making nuclear electricity plants. There's the bamboo curtain in China, which is a form of communism similar to the way that Russia had the Iron Curtain. The economic progression of Argentina, led by President Perón, was behind that of America and Canada, so they really had great economic progress and growth during that time. In 1955, Disneyland opens. People start to write about the problems of false accusations under communism in the USSR. Kind of reminds me of false accusations today that we're having a problem with. Poland tries to rid herself of Russians, and they call it their cause. The British leave Egypt. President Nasser becomes the prime minister of Egypt. There was the Warsaw Pact, but Hungary withdrew from it as they wanted to be free of the Soviet control, requiring exports and rid of other personal freedoms, restrictions of other personal freedoms. Israel invades the Sinai Peninsula. Castro sails with Che Guevara from Mexico to Cuba. Castro accumulates power. Also, Eisenhower creates the federal highway system that serves as a defensive tool to help move troops and give escape paths to civilians in the state of emergencies, hurricanes, whatever. And that's the end of the chapter about 1957.